Hi everyone, I hope you are doing well. Today we will talk about the endocrine system. Thus far in this course, we have learned about the nervous system. We've talked about the structures and classification of neurons. We've also talked about electrical signaling, how signals can travel along an axon and they arrive at the synapses where neurotransmitters are released and responses are elicited in the postsynaptic neuron. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the endocrine system. In the context of endocrine system, we will talk about these crucial communication molecules called hormones, which are comparable to neurotransmitters that we've talked about under the realm of nervous system. Later on in the course, we will talk about other systems such as integumentary system, how skin is structured, digestive system, lymphatic system, urinary system in relation to the organ kidney, and reproductive system, gonads of females and males. Today, we will talk about the endocrine system. What are we trying to achieve in this section? Here are the lecture objectives. First, I'll be introducing the topic of endocrine system in general and also talk about functions. I'll be making comparisons with the nervous system because you're already familiar with that. And also, I'll be talking about hormones. As I said, hormones are communicating molecules in the endocrine system. And it's important that we understand the general functions of hormones and also the major structural classes, what the chemical structures are, and how we categorize them. I'll also explain the mechanisms of hormone action on target organs, how they travel, where they specifically stop moving when they get to the target organ or cell, and what kind of downstream pathways these hormones activate. Let's start with a comparison between the nervous system and the endocrine system. As we know, for the nervous system, the responses are initiated very rapidly, right? It happens in milliseconds. The signals travel for a very short period of time, and then the neurotransmitters are released and they stay there for a bit. And once their roles are done, once the functions are completed, they're taken up by the presynaptic cells or neurons. However, for the endocrine system, the responses are a lot slower. It takes time for hormones to be secreted and for them to travel to different parts of the body. For the nervous system, the responses are very short, or it's known as short duration responses because the effects don't last long. For the endocrine system, however, the responses are long duration or they remain there for a long period of time. And it's also because hormones can stay in the blood for a very long time. It can last for as long as hours, okay, minutes to hours, whereas we are talking about milliseconds or seconds for the nervous system. We know that the nervous system acts via action potentials and functions of neurotransmitters. For the endocrine system, we talk about hormones, right? These communications or signaling happens through hormones and the complex that is formed between hormones and receptors, appropriate receptors. And hormones are released directly into the bloodstream and they travel to different parts of the body. For the nervous system, the neurotransmitters are constrained to specific location between presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. And it's determined by axon pathways, how axons travel, which direction the axon travels, and where they stop. For the endocrine system, the hormones can travel to different locations and they can act at diffuse location. The target organs can be anywhere the blood reaches. Neurotransmitters act over short distances, as we know. The synaptic cleft or the gap between presynaptic neuron and postsynaptic neuron is very short and they're very close to each other. Whereas for the endocrine system, hormones can act over long distances. This illustration here is showing you the difference between the nervous system and endocrine system. At the top, you see the neuron with the dendrites, a structure that you're familiar with. The signal is going to travel through the axon towards the synapse, and you can see these neurotransmitters depicted in blue color. These are released as calcium influx happens, and these are going to elicit responses in the postsynaptic cell. For the endocrine system, the cells that we are interested in talking about are called glandular cells. These are, again, comparable to neurons. Glands are the ones that secrete hormones. Glandular cells are going to produce hormones into the bloodstream, and hormones are going to travel through the bloodstream to their target organs. Once they arrive at the target organ, they encounter target cells and those that are not target cells. The difference between target cells and the non-target cells are that target cells have receptors that are responsive to hormones. Hormones can bind to the receptors, and that complex is going to elicit responses within the cell or activate downstream pathways. However, when the cells do not have receptors, they're not going to respond to the presence of hormones. This figure is showing you different organs involved in the function of endocrine system. Let's start with hypothalamus. I'm sure you're familiar with hypothalamus. We've talked about hypothalamus when we discussed the brain structures, specifically the diencephalon. Pituitary gland is super important too. Pituitary gland is placed right below hypothalamus. We will talk about this in more detail. Talk more about what hormones are produced by hypothalamus and how that affects the function of pituitary gland. We've also talked about pineal gland in the context of diencephalon. We know that this is important for sleep. If you go down in the body, you see thyroid gland and parathyroid glands. Thyroid gland produces hormones that are important for regulating metabolism. Para means near or close by, so parathyroid is close to thyroid gland. And specifically, these are found on the posterior back surface of thyroid gland. You see thymus here, adrenal glands that are close to the kidneys. You see pancreas, which is close to the stomach as well as small intestine, important for digestion. And you see ovary in females, testes in males, testis or testes in males, the gonads of males and females. Okay, so these are all parts that are crucial for endocrine system. We will talk about one at a time. Let's talk about the lexical meaning of the term hormone. Where does it come from? It comes from the word horme from Greek. It means to excite or get something moving. So what does it stimulate? What does it excite? Hormones, when they arrive at the target organs, it's going to stimulate synthesis of structural proteins or enzymes. We know that enzymes catalyze metabolic processes, so these are important for eliciting physiological changes. Hormones are also going to turn existing enzymes or membrane channels on or off. Okay, so it can either trigger synthesis of proteins or turn on or off certain proteins or enzymes. So by turning on certain proteins on or off, what does the endocrine system do? What does it regulate? It's going to regulate processes of growth and development, reproduction, pregnancy, delivery of children, also maintenance of electrolytes, chemicals in the body, concentration of chemicals, osmotic pressure, water, and nutrient balance of the blood. Also, it's going to control or regulate cellular metabolism. Metabolism includes catabolism and anabolism, where we can cut down different proteins or molecules and also make molecules. And also energy balance, whether you're going to use up more energy, whether you're going to store up more energy. Okay? So that's going to be determined by the function of hormones. All right, so now that we've talked about the general functions of endocrine system, let's move on and talk specifically about the structure, chemical structure of hormones. Hormones, again, like neurotransmitters, they can be classified. And we do that by looking at their chemical structures. The first category of hormones are known as amino acid derivatives. Amino acid derivatives are, of course, derived from amino acid structures. Here you can see 20 different types of amino acids. We know that amino acids make up proteins, they make up peptides. So amino acid derivatives are small molecules structurally related to amino acids. One important example is the derivative of tyrosine. You can see tyrosine here. It's a type of aromatic amino acid. Tyrosine can be converted into thyroid hormones, namely T3 and T4. And we know that these are important for regulating metabolism. Okay, so weight loss, weight gain, all types of homeostasis processes are controlled or regulated by these thyroid hormones. Second class of hormones, peptide or protein hormones. These are chains of amino acids. We know what proteins are, chains of amino acids, and peptide hormones are often synthesized as prohormones. Prohormones are precursors of active workable hormones. So these are made as premature hormones and then they go through modifications later on to become more active. Protein hormones include antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. It also includes oxytocin, growth hormone, parathyroid hormone. Okay, so these are the types of protein hormones. The third type is known as lipid derivative. Lipid derivatives are very different from the amino acid derivatives in that these are lipid soluble. Lipid derivatives are also known as steroid hormones, and these are derived from the structure called cholesterol. Cholesterol is a type of lipid, a family of lipid, and steroid hormones are released by reproductive organs, cortex of adrenal glands close to the kidneys, and the kidneys themselves. And some examples of lipid derivative hormones are estrogen, testosterone, aldosterone, and cortisol, stress hormones, and sex hormones. So again, you have amino acid derivatives and you have lipid derivatives. Steroids coming from cholesterol. Examples include estrogen, testosterone, aldosterone, cortisol. So again, stress hormones as well as sex hormones. And amino acid derivatives, a variety of hormones. Okay, we're going to talk about some of them in more detail. One thing I like to accentuate is thyroid hormones, super important for metabolism, regulation of metabolism. You have antidiuretic hormone working on kidneys, oxytocin for delivery of children. You also have growth hormone, important for growth and development, prolactin, making of milk, and many more. So how do hormones travel in the blood? Hormones can travel as free hormones or bound hormones. Free hormones, because they are not protected, they remain functional in the blood vessel for less than 1 hour. That's pretty long though, compared to the neurotransmitters. Bound hormones, which are carried or which are bound to transport proteins, remain in the circulation for much longer, okay, because they are protected or they are transported by these additional proteins. Okay, so you have to know that hormones are characterized by different levels of stability, and that depends on whether they are freely floating in the blood, or whether they are bound to something. So hormones, they're going to travel along the blood vessels and in the bloodstream, and they are going to travel to the target organs, and they would have to elicit some responses. And how does it happen? What is the mechanism? The mechanism depends on the interaction between the hormone and the associated receptor. Before we talk about the specific mechanisms, we have to understand that cells can respond to several different types of hormones. One cell does not only have one type of receptor, but it can carry a variety of receptors. So cells or tissues can respond to a variety of hormones. Okay, so same thing. Different tissues have different combination of receptors. And presence or absence of specific receptor determines hormonal sensitivity. What hormones it's going to be sensitive towards. Okay, what hormones it's going to respond to. And the production of different hormones are going to be regulated by the feedback system. When there are lots of hormones produced and when a lot of the receptors are occupied by the hormones, then it's going to send a message to the glands to stop producing hormones. And when the receptors are free, when nothing is bound to them, then it's going to send signals to the glands to produce more of them, okay, when necessary. Okay, so you have to know that there is down regulation or up regulation of these hormone productions. What are the mechanisms of action for different types of hormones? We have to make a distinction between steroid, lipid derivatives, and amino acid derivatives. Steroids are, of course, lipid soluble, and amino acids are more water soluble. So depending on their characteristics or tendencies, they're going to act differently. Let's first look at the lipid soluble hormones. We have the free hormones here. And these free hormones are going to travel to the target organ or target cell. And because they are lipid soluble, they're going to be able to cross the cell membrane, the lipid bilayer. They're also able to cross the nuclear membrane. So they're going to go into the organelle nucleus and form a complex with a receptor that's in the nucleus. So once this complex forms, they usually act as transcription factors, which are going to help with the transcription process, conversion of DNA into mRNA. So transcription factors, they are going to bind to the DNA and convert DNA into mRNA, help the conversion of DNA into mRNA. And once mRNA is formed, it's going to go to ribosome to be synthesized into protein. Okay, RNA into protein, amino acids. And this protein is going to alter cell activity. Okay, so that's how lipid-soluble hormones work. Now moving on to amino acid derivatives. They work differently. Amino acid derivatives, they are more water-soluble, so they cannot penetrate through the cell membrane. They're going to come to the target cell and bind to the receptors on the surface, on the cell membrane. And these receptors are often G-coupled, G-protein coupled, GPCR, G-protein coupled receptors. Okay, coupled receptors that are associated with G protein, molecules called G protein. So once this complex forms, it's going to activate G protein. Okay, and once G proteins are activated, they're going to bind to adenylate cyclase. And adenylate cyclase is going to allow the conversion of ATP into CAMP. CAMP is known as a second messenger, something that's activated in the downstream pathway. The first messenger is the hormone. Okay, first messenger is the hormone, and the second messenger is the molecule called CAMP. So triphosphate is converted into monophosphate, and CAMP is going to activate an enzyme called kinase, which is capable of phosphorylating proteins. So kinase is activated, and depending on what protein is going to phosphorylate, it can either inhibit or activate the protein. So in this case, you can see the activated protein. These activated proteins are going to cause reactions that produce physiological responses. So you have to remember that amino acid derivatives are not capable of trespassing the cell membrane, and they're going to remain on the outside. And instead of making that complex to form a transcription factor, it's going to interact with G protein coupled receptors. Okay, so time to test yourself. Something is to endocrine system as action potentials or neurotransmitters are for the nervous system. Functions of endocrine system include something, something, and something. Number 3, two structural groups of hormones are something and something. Number 4, the lipid derivative originates from something. Okay, so try these on your own, and we will take this up next time. Okay, but all the answers are in the lecture content, so it'll be doable to complete these questions. Moving on. So far we've talked about the endocrine system, functions. We've made a comparison between nervous system and endocrine system, and we've talked about hormones, general classes, structures, and also mechanisms that are associated with the structures. Now we're going to move on and talk specifically about hypothalamus and pituitary gland. There is a close association between hypothalamus and pituitary gland. We're going to talk about the location of these organs, relevant hormones, and functions of the hormones and each of these organs. Also, we are going to talk about one anomaly that can happen in the pituitary gland and the related hormone production. Okay, let's talk about pituitary gland. Another name for pituitary gland is hypophysis. It means to grow under. What does it grow under? Hypo, under. What does it grow under? It grows under hypothalamus. As you can see the pituitary gland over here. Hypothalamus, we know that it's part of diencephalon in the brain, right? Pituitary gland, you can see it here, these sac-like structures. It's divided into anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. You can see this bone that's supporting the pituitary gland. It's known as sella turcica. The blood vessels associated with hypothalamus and pituitary gland is known as hypophyseal portal system. You can see the cross-sectional view of the same structures, hypothalamus here, posterior pituitary, anterior pituitary, these small regions over here, and also infundibulum. What is infundibulum? It's stalk-like structure, root-like structure between hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is very small. It's the size of a grape. And as we have just seen, there are two lobes, anterior and posterior. Here you can see depictions of pituitary gland. As I said, infundibulum is the connection between hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Here you can see anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Anterior, another name is adenohypophysis. Adenohypophysis. Another name for posterior pituitary is neurohypophysis. Neurohypophysis. More realistic illustrations of hypothalamus and pituitary gland, infundibulum again, and hypothalamus and pituitary gland over here. Pituitary gland is known as the master gland. Why is that? Because pituitary gland is going to secrete hormones that are capable of controlling other endocrine glands, almost all of them. However, pituitary gland is not really the real master because itself has a master, which is hypothalamus. Depending on what hormones hypothalamus produces, it's going to regulate the production of specific hormones in pituitary gland, which are in turn going to affect other endocrine glands. Okay, so in reality, hypothalamus is the real master, which is going to affect the pituitary gland. All right, so what's the relationship between hypothalamus and pituitary gland? We know that hypothalamus is the real master, but what does that really mean? So hypothalamus is the source of many hormones, the real source, origin of all these hormones. Hypothalamus can produce two types of hormones in the context of its relationship with pituitary gland. Okay, so what does that mean? Hypothalamus can produce, okay, there are two ways. Hypothalamus can produce hormones that are going to be released directly into the pituitary gland. And those can travel to the target organs and elicit responses there. So hormones that are produced by hypothalamus, they're just going to pass by the pituitary and then travel to the target organ, okay? The other way the hypothalamus works with the pituitary gland is to produce regulatory hormones. Okay, so instead of producing hormones, regular hormones, it's going to produce something called regulatory hormones. And what this does is it's going to be a signal for pituitary to produce other hormones, okay, pituitary's own hormones. Once the pituitary produces its own hormones, that's going to go to the target organs or target glands and elicit these responses, downstream responses. Okay, so this is more of an indirect way of hypothalamus acting on pituitary gland, whereas these hormones that are produced by hypothalamus that go directly into pituitary gland and go to other target organs, these can be seen as a more direct way in which hypothalamus has an effect on target organs. Okay, it doesn't depend on the function of pituitary, but rather pituitary is like a midpoint where these hormones go and just pass through to get to other target organs. Okay, so we are going to talk about that in more detail, so don't worry about that too much for now. All right, so pituitary gland stays in close contact or close distance with hypothalamus. And pituitary gland secretes hormones that control other glands and tissues. Okay, I will give you some examples about that. So for now, just remember that hypothalamus is the master and it's going to affect the function of pituitary and production of hormones within the pituitary. This figure here is showing you the relationship between hypothalamus, pituitary gland, as well as other organs in the body. Okay, so what's happening? Hypothalamus, as I said, can produce hormones or regulatory hormones. Okay, so depending on what's produced, it's going to affect the function of pituitary gland. It's going to either elicit or inhibit the production of different hormones in the pituitary gland. And once pituitary gland produces hormones, also known as trophic factors, these are going to travel to target glands, other glands in the body, such as adrenal glands. It says here, adrenal glands, thyroid glands, or gonads, or sex organs of females and males. And distinct hormones are released at these locations. And these are going to travel to target cells where physiological effects would be triggered. The physiological effects can include regulation of growth and development, water balance, osmotic pressure, concentration of chemicals in the blood, metabolism, making and cutting down of specific molecules, sexual maturities, sexual activities, and stress responses. Okay, let's zoom into the posterior part of pituitary gland and how the function of posterior lobe is related to the function of hypothalamus. Posterior lobe is also known as neural hypophysis. Where does the prefix neural come from? This prefix comes from the fact that posterior lobe is composed largely of neural tissue. We know neural tissue is composed of neurons, right? So there has to be some kind of electrical signaling or secretion of something. What happens at the posterior lobe? There is neurosecretion. These neuron-like structures or specialized neurons coming from hypothalamus, these are going to travel to the posterior lobe. Okay, so this is the posterior lobe of pituitary gland. So these are going to travel to the posterior lobe, specifically to the capillaries in the posterior lobe. So what are the functions of these nuclei, these specialized neurons? These are going to have hormones that are produced by hypothalamus. So once hypothalamus makes certain hormones, they are going to travel through these nuclei and go all the way to posterior lobe and get released in the capillaries of the posterior lobe. Okay, and that is known as neurosecretion because these hormones are secreted from neuron-like structures or cells. Okay, so these hormones are secreted by these specialized neurons, and the hormones are received by the posterior lobe, ready-made by the hypothalamus. So what are these nuclei called, these specialized neurons called? There are two types of nuclei that are coming from hypothalamus specifically to the posterior lobe. It includes supraoptic nucleus and paraventricular nucleus. We know that nucleus or nuclei from the section about nervous system mean clusters of cell bodies or neurons. Okay, so these are specialized neurons again. So these nuclei are neurosecretory cells that are going to secrete hormones into the posterior lobe. Okay, and the hormones are released into the capillary beds of posterior pituitary. So what are these hormones that are coming from hypothalamus to the posterior lobe? They are specifically oxytocin and vasopressin, just two of them. Okay, oxytocin and vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone, these come from hypothalamus and get into posterior lobe directly. I'm sure you've heard about them, but what are their functions? Let's talk about oxytocin first. Oxytocin is a hormone that stimulates smooth muscle contractions in the walls of uterus, promoting labor and delivery. So this is super important for pregnancy and delivery of children. It becomes important even after delivery in that it's going to let milk flow from the breast to the children during lactation. And the stimulus for this lactation is the infant suckling sensation stimulation. Okay, so when the infant suckles the breast, then it's going to stimulate the production of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. There are some additional functions associated with oxytocin. The first is linked to sexual activity. So this can be applied to both males and females. And also oxytocin, production of oxytocin is related to emotional bonding. Okay, social interactions and bonding that happens from emotional connection. Let's now move on to vasopressin, another hormone that's produced by hypothalamus and that's released into the posterior lobe. Vasopressin, its another name is antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH. This is released into the posterior pituitary in response to a variety of stimuli. Now let's talk about vasopressin. Its another name is antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH. ADH is released into the target cells in response to a variety of stimuli. One stimulation comes from the sensation of osmoreceptors, which sense the change in osmotic pressure, the concentration of different chemicals in the blood, osmotic pressure of the blood vessels. The functions of vasopressin include increase of water absorption. It's going to increase water absorption in kidneys so that more water is present in the body. It also acts on sweat glands and inhibits sweating, thereby making the body retain more water. And at high concentration of vasopressin, it's going to act as vasoconstrictor where blood pressure increases because of the higher prevalence of water. Okay, so as we have talked about, another name for vasopressin is antidiuretic hormone. So you can think of this as anti-urine or antidiuresis. You can think of it as anti-urination, where discarding of water is inhibited. Here's a summary of what's happening from hypothalamus to posterior lobe. As I said, the stimulations include sensory stimulation and osmoreceptor stimulation, right? Sensory stimulation for the production of oxytocin, osmoreceptor stimulation for antidiuretic hormone. Once antidiuretic hormone is produced, it's going to act on the kidneys, right? Reabsorption of water. And oxytocin is going to act on both males and females, males, emotional bonding, sexual maturity, and also females, uterine smooth muscle. It's going to act on uterine smooth muscles and also mammary glands. Let's now talk about the other side of pituitary gland, the anterior lobe. Another name for anterior lobe is adenohypophysis. And there are two other nuclei that are associated with anterior lobe and hypothalamus. The names are arcuate nucleus and periventricular nucleus. There are distinct differences between how hypothalamus works with posterior lobe and how hypothalamus works with anterior lobe. For the posterior lobe, we've talked about the fact that the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus are going to travel to posterior lobe and get released into the capillary bed. But for the anterior lobe, it's going to work a little bit differently. These hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus are going to travel through the neuron, the specialized neurons, and they are going to be released in the capillaries a bit earlier, near the infundibulum. These are going to be released into the capillary bed over here, and then from there, the hormones are going to travel to the anterior lobe through the blood vessels. Okay, so the regulating hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus is going to travel through the blood vessels to the anterior pituitary. Not to the posterior, they're going to go directly into the posterior lobe, but for anterior pituitary, the hormones are going to travel through the blood vessels. Okay, so the hormones from hypothalamus are going to go into the integrative centers, the neurons in the hypothalamus, and travel through the neurons, but just halfway, and get released as regulatory hormones. And what happens is these regulatory hormones that are produced into the blood vessels, they are going to travel to the anterior lobe and either induce or inhibit the production of other hormones in the anterior lobe. This is very different from the posterior lobe because for the posterior lobe, we've seen that oxytocin and vasopressin, those are produced in the hypothalamus, and they have nothing to stimulate. They don't stimulate any production in the posterior lobe, right? They go directly into the target cells. But in the case of anterior lobe, the anterior lobe is going to produce other additional hormones as a response to the function of hypothalamus. So the regulatory hormones that are produced by hypothalamus that are going to act on anterior lobe can be categorized into two. One is releasing hormone and the other is inhibiting hormone. So the anterior lobe is going to produce some hormones, also known as trophic factors. And the trophic factors are going to act on other endocrine glands, and these are going to produce second sets of hormones, and those hormones are going to work on the target cells. Okay, so there are more steps involved for the anterior lobe compared to the posterior lobe. So the regulating hormone is going to regulate cells of anterior pituitary to secrete trophic factors, other hormones. Okay, and these are going to work on endocrine glands. And the rate of secretion of the trophic factors is controlled by negative feedback. Not only the trophic factors, but also the regulatory hormones, the production of regulatory hormones. Okay, so depending on the level of hormone number 2, the production of trophic factor and regulating hormone is going to be affected. The anterior lobe can be divided into two sections. One is pars distalis, and the other is pars intermedia. As you can imagine, intermedia means intermediate, so it's in the middle between the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Something special about pars intermedia is that it's going to release hormone called melanocyte stimulating hormone, whereas pars distalis is going to produce all other pituitary hormones. Okay, and we know that posterior lobe is going to release vasopressin and oxytocin. This figure here is showing you a summary of what's happening with hypothalamus and two lobes of pituitary gland. So as I have talked about, there are nuclei that are stemming from hypothalamus, which are going to go directly into the posterior pituitary and release oxytocin and vasopressin at the capillary beds. For anterior pituitary, it works differently, right? There are neurons that are stemming from hypothalamus, but these are going to release the hormones, the regulating hormones, near the capillary bed at the top, near the infundibulum. And the hormones, the regulating hormones, are going to travel down through the anterior pituitary through the blood vessels. And once they arrive there, they're going to induce, either stimulate or inhibit the production of trophic factors by the endocrine cells. Here's a list of hormones that are produced by both the posterior pituitary and anterior lobe. Let's start with a simpler one, posterior lobe. So we have talked about oxytocin and antithyroid hormone. These are produced, again, by the hypothalamus. They travel directly into the posterior lobe and they act on the target organs. Anterior lobe is different, right? Anterior lobe is going to produce its own hormones, trophic factors. And they include growth factor, TSH, which stands for thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. Some of these are important for other sections of the course, such as reproductive system or urinary system. So we will leave some of these aside to discuss in more detail later on. For now, let's look at a few examples. Let's take a look at the thyroid hormones. Let's start with the hypothalamus. We know that hypothalamus is going to produce regulating hormone, right? So in this case, it's producing TRH. In this specific example, it's producing TRH. And TRH stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone, which, as the name implies, is going to induce the production of something. It's going to release something. What is it going to induce? It's going to stimulate the production of TSH from the anterior pituitary gland. TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. So this trophic factor is going to travel to the bloodstream, and then it's going to stimulate the secretion of certain thyroid hormones. So this trophic hormone, which is released into the bloodstream, it's going to travel to the thyroid gland and help the thyroid gland produce or secrete thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones such as T3 or T4, they're going to stimulate, they're going to travel through the bloodstream again, and they're going to arrive at the target cells where these responses are going to be elicited. And usually we know that thyroid hormones are involved in regulation of weight, energy levels, skin, hair, nail growth, metabolism, etc. So when you experience diseases such as hypothyroidism, where these thyroid hormones are not produced for any reason, for genetic reasons, or dysfunction of hypothalamus or pituitary gland, then you're going to experience a variety of symptoms related to homeostasis, such as weight gain or, lack of energy, lethargy, and etc. Another example, production of prolactin. The hypothalamus is going to produce either prolactin releasing hormone or prolactin inhibiting hormone. The names are easy to understand, right? It's going to either release or inhibit something, and specifically in this case, prolactin. What's the function of prolactin? The name tells us a lot, right? It's prolactin. So it's going to stimulate the mammary gland development and stimulate milk production. In males, it's also important. It's going to increase testosterone production, sex hormone, and testosterone is crucial for spermatogenesis, which means making of sperm. One other example of the function of anterior pituitary, production of growth hormone. Another name for growth hormone is somatotropin. Okay, depending on what hormone is released by hypothalamus, what regulating hormone is released by hypothalamus, either growth hormone releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone, you're going to produce different levels of somatotropin. Growth hormone is going to stimulate body cells to grow and reproduce. And it also accelerates the rate of certain protein so that the body can use them as enzymes or any other functions, and so that growth can be promoted. Here you can see an example of the growth hormone structure. This is taken from Protein Database. You can see growth hormone that's composed of many amino acids, specifically 191 amino acids, and it has many alpha helices. An example of anomaly of a hormone or hormone production. Growth hormone that's at abnormally high level in children is going to cause a disorder called gigantism. Gigantism is characterized by abnormally tall height, rapid growth of cartilage and bones, as you can see in this figure, cardiovascular and respiratory complications coming from this rapid growth and excessive development in these individuals who suffer from the disease. What are the causes? Etiology: cancer in pituitary gland, pituitary adenomas, also hyperplasia, something high, right? Hyperplasia means there is an increase in number of cells in an organ or tissue that's abnormal. One treatment option would be surgical removal of these excessively grown parts of the body. This disease is genetically affected. There is that inherent factor that plays a role. And as we just talked about, it relates to overgrowth of certain areas of the body. Self-assessment. Number 1, this is known as the master gland. Second question, the real master of this master gland is something. Number 3, hypothalamus secretes something and something into the posterior pituitary. Number 4, anterior pituitary is composed of something and something. Examples of hormones each produces are. Number 5, 2 classes of hormones produced by hypothalamus into anterior pituitary are something and something. Okay, try these on your own again, and we will take them up later. All right, so we are now done talking about the location, associated hormones and functions of hypothalamus and pituitary gland, these crucial organs in the body that are involved in the endocrine system. And we've talked about one example of abnormality in the production of a specific hormone in the pituitary gland.